A little while ago, I wrote a blog post revisiting what my purpose in life was. For people who read it, a lot of what I grappled with there was around the expectations I had set for myself and dealing with the fact that according to some of those expectations, I was a failure. While I think there were a lot of interesting stuff in that blog post around how I recalibrated the expectations I set for myself and understood what my purpose was, I didn't really talk much about how I got there. That journey, which I think was one of the most important in my life, is what I want to talk about today. We're going to meander through a few different concepts before things hopefully start to make cogent sense, so please bear with me. The place we're going to start is consciousness. Our consciousness, I think, might be the most interesting thing about ourselves that we very rarely take the time to reflect on. Just so we're on the same page, let me quickly define what I'm talking about when I use the word consciousness. The consciousness I'm talking about is the subjective experience accompanying every action and thought we live through as humans. It feels like something to be you. It feels a certain way to experience the pleasure of eating your favorite dessert. The feeling of guilt that follows also has a very discernible subjective quality, totally unique from the feeling of elation that preceded it. Even actions that are quite disconnected from what we would typically consider human emotion have a subjective quality to them when you pay attention. It certainly feels like something to be you solving a math equation, for example. There's usually a voice in your head that you're conversing with. Maybe I'll try dividing both sides by x. What was the sine value of 90 degrees again? You certainly are able to describe the way you work through the problem. Now, there are certainly several things that we perform subconsciously, but what I'm going to talk about today is quite far away from being a subconscious phenomenon. So we'll table the topic of subconsciousness for today. Okay, let's get into what's on the title of the podcast. Failure. Let's think about what failure looks like in the context of consciousness we just defined. Quite simply put, how does it feel to experience failure? How does it feel when you make a mistake at work and get called out in a meeting for it? How does it feel when you let down a friend or a family member who counted on you? How does it feel when you're unable to keep your partner happy in a relationship? How does it feel when you give it your everything only to be told it wasn't enough? The sinking feeling of anguish, the knot in your stomach, the self-loathing, the voice in your head that tells you to give up, to never try again, to not fight back. This is what failure feels like. And we've all felt it at some point in our lives. Now, this is where I want to lay down a few different markers. In the last 30 seconds, I described the different emotions that we tend to experience when we deal with failure. But oftentimes in reality, we don't just experience failure, we just call ourselves failures. Now, this is not just a mere shift in semantics, it's something much more sinister. Rather than just experiencing the emotions and thoughts that accompany failure, we associate ourselves with failure. By default, we tend to associate the self, or who we are as a person, with what we experience in consciousness. But why am I so particular about making this distinction? It's because I believe we are not the authors of our own thoughts. We don't have any control over the next thought that arises in our minds that we are dispositioned to experience in our consciousness. Okay, so let's linger here a little bit, because what I've just done is claim that you don't have free will, or at least that it's just an illusion. Let's do a quick thought experiment together. Try to focus on something specific. Let's say a pirate ship. Let's try to picture the mast with a large black sail and a large skull painted on it. Let's hold it there for a second. Now, in those few seconds of silence, what were the voices in your head saying? Maybe the voice in your head was saying, "Where on earth is Rishi going with this pirate ship exercise?" Or maybe you're picturing more features of the pirate ship. Or maybe you're thinking about what you should have for dinner. Whatever these voices or thoughts in your head may be, think about where they're coming from. Think about if you really had any control over their creation. Thoughts just appear in consciousness for us to experience. You truly have no control over the next thought that appears in your brain. Another quite straightforward way to expose the illusion of free will is to consciously try to turn off the thought creation process. Try to stop the next thought from appearing. It's impossible. The act of trying to think nothing just creates more thoughts in consciousness. Okay, if you can follow me along this path and grant me that free will is indeed an illusion, what does that mean? If none of the thoughts in our brain were truly authored by us, does that mean we're just puppeted by thoughts that arise in our brain? Although I don't like the framing of what I just said, I think it's factually true. Thoughts arise in our brain when neurons fire in certain patterns. Which neuron fires is influenced by both factors internal, like genetics, your physiological body state, and external, like upbringing, environment, culture, etc. To really drive this point home, let me take the example of one Charles Whitman. On August 1, 1966, Whitman, a former Marine, climbed to the observation deck of the University of Texas at Austin's main building and began shooting, killing 16 people and wounding 31 others. Horrific, right? Now, a traditional response to this would be to call Charles Whitman a despicable, sadistic, and evil person, and quite understandably so. Now, let's add a little more information about Whitman. In a note found after the shootings, Whitman described himself experiencing mental struggles and sought an explanation for his actions. He wrote about experiencing intense headaches and irrational thoughts. Whitman had also sought medical help for these symptoms. After Whitman was killed by police, an autopsy revealed that he had a brain tumor pressing against his amygdala. The amygdala is the part of the brain involved in emotion regulation, particularly fear and aggression. Experts believe that the tumor might have directly contributed to his violent behavior. Now, think about how much this information changed our framing of the incident. Whitman, more than anything else, was a victim of his tumor. His medical condition predispositioned him to be a certain kind of person. My argument is that we are all predispositioned to be the people we are due to factors outside of our control. We all carry metaphorical versions of Whitman's tumor that bias us to think in certain ways. Like I mentioned before, these include things like genetics, upbringing, culture, and so on. If you had a liking for classical music, can you truly know why? Even if you did your best to explain why you like certain sounds and instruments and so on, where did those preferences come from? One of the most common things that we all worry about is how we wish we had done things differently. But in reality, you really couldn't have. If you were able to rewind the universe to a decision point in such a way that every atom was where it was, your brain would just create the same thought again. Thoughts just arise in our brains. We just experience them in consciousness. Now, going back to what this all means, should we now be resigned to the fact that we don't have any control over our thoughts and actions? Should we resign ourselves to doing nothing because nothing really matters? I don't think so. Although this is a very common criticism of this line of thinking, in my opinion, the knowledge that free will is an illusion can be weaponized to help us deal with negative emotions. This brings us back nicely to failure. When we go through the emotions of failure, think about what is happening. Think about the voices in your head. The voices that tell you that you're not good enough. The voices that tell you to give up. The voices that tell you that you don't deserve happiness. Observe these voices in your consciousness and recognize them for what they are. Thoughts emanating from the Pandora's box that is our brain. Observe these voices and just let them fade away. Observe these voices from a truly third-person perspective and distance the self from the thoughts. This is what I call mindfulness. The ability to truly observe thoughts for what they are, not letting yourself associate yourself with your thoughts and letting it go. This is what mindfulness is. Now, mindfulness definitely requires practice. But for me, exposing the illusion of free will and recognizing that we don't author our own thoughts was essentially a cheat code that let me disengage myself from my thoughts much more rapidly. Realizing this has been the single most valuable thing I've learned in my entire life. It is also especially interesting for me academically because of the subjective nature of this concept. Every person can test this out themselves in their own subjective reality and work their way towards the realization that free will is in fact an illusion. There's a lot more to talk about free will and consciousness, and I'll continue to do so in future episodes. The lack of free will changes the framing for so many things in society: religion, the judicial system, social media, and much more. But these are topics for a different day. If there's one thing you can take away from this podcast, I want it to be this: what you think and feel and ponder over is not what you are. You are not your thoughts, although your mind does its best to convince you so. Breaking this illusion just might be the most important thing you do in your life.